All right, welcome everybody to Christian Fiction Fans. Today we have with us Johanna Vann, and I'm just going to read her bio to introduce her to you, and then we're going to jump into some questions. So, Johanna is a wife, mother, and professional writer with a passion for stories that highlight the complexity and beauty of diverse families, and we definitely felt that in this novel. As a second generation Columbian American, she hopes to use the power of story to foster an appreciation and understanding of minority families in the United States today. And I definitely did through this. This was really a great opportunity for me to see a different perspective. An American Immigrant is her debut novel, and it won Best First Novel at the Christie Awards last fall. It also, at the International Latino Book Award, was a gold winner for Best First Book in Fiction. She was a silver winner for the Isabel Allende Most Inspirational Fiction, and she was a Tennessee State Book Award finalist. She lives and writes in Nashville, Tennessee, where the coffee is good and the people are even better. I love that. So,
Thanks.
welcome, Johanna.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, we just love having our authors come and tell us about their journeys. So, would you start with that? Share your journey to becoming an author. Is that something you always wanted to be, or it just kind of fell into it? How did that all happen?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I thought that I would want to be a writer when I was a little girl because I guess it just never crossed my mind as something that was even possible. I did always love the written word. I always loved books. And so I think as I got older and I studied journalism in college, wanted to be in broadcasting. But anyway, I continued to fall in love with books over time, but I never had the thought, hey, I should be a novelist. That never crossed my mind. That never was the kind of writing that I thought I would do. I thought I would either do news writing or magazine writing, but certainly not novels. So it wasn't until I started hearing these stories from my mom. I was in college at the time and kind of just held on to them. I would intuitively sometimes just write them down, or I would voice memo her sharing a story with me from her upbringing or coming over to America. And then it wasn't until I was newly married that my husband just brought it up one day, like, hey, you should write that like in a story, in a book. That would be a really interesting. He always thought that the stories I shared were very interesting. And I was just like, is that interesting? I don't know. This just the only reality that I know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was, I guess it might have been in 2020 that I started just playing with that idea of writing it. And I wrote like maybe a sample chapter here and there whenever I had a few minutes. But then when my son was born, my first baby was born in 2021, I left corporate America. I didn't have a full-time job anymore. I just had this little baby to take care of. And I started freelancing a little bit just to make some money on the side. And it was kind of overwhelming and stressful with the baby and a new mother. And it was my husband who looked at me one day and said, when are you going to stop writing for other people and write for yourself? I really think you need
Oh,
to write this book.
I
And I
love
was like,
that.
are you sure? So anyway, when my baby was about 5 months old, I stopped all of my freelance work and I said, I'm just going to try to write this in a book. I didn't have these great big ambitions of it actually getting published or getting a book deal or anything like that. I just thought I would get it all down on paper and maybe one day I would share it with my kids.
Yeah.
And so it took about 6 months, I think, to write the book. It was like June to like October of 21. I wrote the book. And then once I read that first draft, I was like, huh, this could really be a book. Maybe I have something here. So I did some more, I hired an editor to help me. And I just wanted a professional to tell me, is this any good? Should I even try?
Yeah.
And she was really encouraging. And she was really encouraging, but she also was like, you have made a million and one mistakes. Let's fix this together. So
Right.
she helped me fix it and I did made a bunch of changes and yeah, it all just worked out from there. Honestly, it was just God opening door after door after door after door. I got an agent a few months after that. She shopped it around and we got a book deal soon after that. And then the day before my second child was born, I signed a contract with Waterbrook and
Wow.
Multnomah. So that was a very eventful season of life where, I signed that contract. I have pictures. We're celebrating with my huge pregnant belly. The very next day, my daughter was born. And 2 months after she was born, I was working on edits with
Uh-huh.
newborn and a son who's not even 2 yet. So it was quite stressful, but it all worked for good. And I know that the Lord helped me through all of it, because looking back, I'm like, I don't know how I did any of that. And it was clearly with the
Right.
Lord's strength. So here, yeah. And so now the book is here, and yeah, it's been an incredible journey.
That's amazing. So I've heard lots of stories from authors about trying to find their agent, but it sounds like that was not a super hard process, or are you just glossing over some things?
No, honestly, it really did happen really quickly. And I know that's not common or rare. I didn't have connections in the industry or anything like that. I did what most authors do. I made a list of agents that I wanted to pitch, and I started cold pitching, and I got a bunch of no's. But there was one agent whom I'd seen on like an on training video, and she had talked about how she loves stories about minority families and things like that. So I
Mm,
did pitch her with that, and she read my novel and she liked it, and we really clicked. And so it worked out really well. Honestly, again, it was all God opening doors, because it really doesn't normally work that way in the industry. It takes a really long time to even just get past writing the manuscript, let alone
yeah,
getting an agent and a book deal in the same year. So yeah, it was an incredible experience. So I did get a bunch of no's, but hey, you only need one yes.
that's right. That's right. But yeah, I've heard lots of stories of when authors start querying, it's not uncommon to query 100 different
Yes.
agents before you
Mhm.
find an agent that will say yes.
Yeah.
And the fact that you were even getting no's, like a lot of authors don't even get a response.
Mhm.
It's
That's
just
true.
crickets. So,
Yes, it's so true. Very
so
lonely sport.
yeah. Yeah, so that's great. I mean, it really does seem like God had a hand in this and
For
was
sure.
opening doors for you and helping you. So this is your first novel, um, and your books already were finalists and won awards. That's remarkable. So talk to us a little bit about the process of those awards. I'm sure there's an application process. Is that something that you like picked out and said these are the awards I want to look at, or did your publisher do that? And tell us about that process.
Yeah, last fall was an incredible season for me to just, I'm sure it's really easy as a mom with really little children to just get caught up in the day to day and just kind of forget. I often just forget that I have a book, that I'm an author, that I'm supposed to be working on another book, that
Because
all
you're
these.
busy changing diapers and cleaning up
Yeah.
toys and
Yes, they don't give me a moment to think about anything but what their needs are in that
yeah.
moment. And so last fall when I got these emails and calls, like the Tennessee Book Award was a call. I just got a call one day and was like, "Hey, I have good news." And I was like, "What?" I was at the playground with my kids and I was like, "What?" And then it felt like they just kept coming in. It was award season and I got an email that I was a finalist in this and that. And I was like, "Wow, God, like you you've truly blown me away." Just the book deal alone was blowing me away, and the response, the stories that I've heard from people was blowing me away. And now these awards to just affirm that this was a story that he wanted the world to know about for whatever personal reasons that readers have. But so yeah, the process was a little bit of everything. I did some. My publisher did the Christie Award. That's obviously a very popular Christian fiction award, and so they made sure to submit my book for consideration at the start of when it opened up for submissions. And when they did that in the spring of last year, I started thinking, well, what else could I submit my book to? Because you know, who knows? Maybe I'll win something. And so I personally did the Tennessee Book Award and the Latino Book Award. Actually, the Latino Book Award, somebody emailed me and said, "Hey, have you considered submitting your book for consideration for this award?" And I had never heard of it before. And so I looked into it and I was like, "Oh wow, this is pretty cool. They're really working hard to recognize Latin authors." And so I submitted my book for consideration, and then it all came out in the fall within about 6 weeks of each other, all three. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is
Wow.
incredible." truly a dream come true, and truly just even amazing that I got to be in Chicago for the Christie Award in person, because it's not
Mm.
in person every year. So I got to be there in person. I got to accept my award, which is, you can't really see it because it's glass.
Oh, fun.
But the fact that I got to accept that in person was just so sweet. And so that was a fun season. And thank you for reminding me that again, because again, I just forget that all these amazing things have happened.
Yeah, well, you're in the thick of it, and
Yes.
well, you should be focusing on your children. That's a good thing, but
Yeah.
yeah, you need to give yourself a pat on the back once in a while too.
Thank you.
So this is based on a true story, and you've kind of alluded to that. Tell us, where is the line between fact and fiction in this story? Is this really, it's like almost a memoir, or is it just you kind of picked and chose things from it?
Yeah, definitely. I would say a little bit of both. So the inspiration obviously came from my mom's story whenever she was telling me all of these stories about what it was like growing up in Colombia, what it was like to cross over the border, what it was like to be a new immigrant in New York City and raise children and all that, all those stories. I wanted to share her story. I thought that her story was so just magnificent, beautiful, inspiring. And so I knew that I wanted to share her story, but I felt like my husband continued to remind me that the story of the second generation is extremely interesting too. And it's one that we don't often see. We hear some immigrant stories, but it's I feel like we're almost like we kind of hide. We can really blend really well when we're second generation. We go to school, we go to the workplace, and we speak English like everyone else, and
Hmm.
we have the same customs and cultural things, like everyone else. So we can blend. But what people don't know is that, when I was, for example, in elementary school or middle school, or whatever, I would go home and I was speaking Spanish. And I was
Hmm.
eating foods that were very different that they were eating. And I was visiting aunts and uncles who didn't speak English or who might have been undocumented, or it was like a completely different world that I was living in that friends had no idea about, because they only saw the me at school, or they only saw the me in the workplace who looks like them and talks like them and acts like them. And so I thought it would be really cool to also share that story. But I wanted to share. So, okay. So the story of Anita, the mother, that one I would say is about 90% true. Almost all of that story in the book is true, which is pretty
Wow.
fun that I get to share all of that. And so my mom did a lot of early readings to make sure that
Yeah.
everything was okay. So that is mostly true. The story of Melanie, which obviously reflects my experience, is like, I don't know, 20 to 30% true. There's a lot of that story that I never lived. I never went to Columbia and like found a journal or anything like that.
Hmm.
But the feelings that she had in her as a young person, of feeling frustrated, of like being pulled between these two worlds constantly, of like, well, my mother doesn't understand me, she doesn't get this world that I live in, and this world doesn't get me either. And I wanted to share that experience. So a lot of the feelings that she has and walks through is very accurate to what I experienced growing up. I really was frustrated with my parents growing up. Like, it really was hard to
Yeah.
communicate and to had to explain everything to them, the cultural things that they weren't used to and they thought were strange. And, so all of that tension I wanted to share. So I would say that part of it is very true. And then Alba was my grandmother's name. She's passed now, but that was her name. And so I wanted to use that in the book. And my grandmother was very similar to the grandmother displayed in the book. I never went to Colombia to see her there. She actually came to America when I was probably in middle school and lived with us for a couple of high school and lived with us for a couple of years, maybe 10 years before she passed away. She got really sick. But for the time that I did know her, so I didn't know her most of my life, but those short 10 years that I did know her, that was the Alba that I knew. She was, feisty and fiery, and she was very strong and strong-willed and stubborn and independent. And so that was the grandmother that I knew, and that was the grandmother that I wanted to honor in the book. And so for the most part, a lot of it is fictionalized, especially the stories in Colombia are very fictionalized. But the journey that Anita walks through it's pretty accurate to what my mom experienced.
Wow. Wow. So, did you know your mother's story as you were growing up? Because in the book it's portrayed that Melanie just has no clue about her mom's immigration experience until she comes upon these journals. But it sounds like maybe you heard those stories growing up.
No, I didn't. I didn't
Wow.
actually. So that part is true. And to be honest, I wish I could tell you how that's even possible. Like, how did I live so much of my life in this home with my mother, side by side, living with her, and didn't know any of these stories? It wasn't until she started sharing more with me in college. I was, I think, a freshman in college when she started. She would share little things here and there, and my ears would perk up, and I'd say, "Wait a minute." Let's go back for a second. I need to hear that again. Or what do you mean by that? Or what really happened? Or tell me more. And I think, and I kind of shared about this in the book too. I think a lot of it comes back to when you're young, you don't really your children are pretty selfish, right? Like all they think about is themselves and their concerns and what they need, and they don't often think about the backgrounds that their parents lived or what their parents
Yeah.
experienced as children. Like they just don't ask those questions a lot of time. They're just consumed with their own world, and that's okay. That's just, children. They're just consumed in their own world and their own matters and their friends and their school, whatever. And so I don't remember ever asking too many questions. I'm sure they shared things here and there, but it probably just went in one ear, not the other. And so it wasn't until I was, I guess, more mature,
Yeah.
able to just appreciate those stories a little bit more, that I started seeing my mother as a real person. Like, oh, wait a
Hmm.
minute, you're not just my mom. You're like this whole human that lived this whole life before having me. And a lot of that life was extremely interesting and shaped who you are. And that's has shaped who I am because you raised me. And so it all started clicking. And I just realized, wow, like you're pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like there all these cool things have happened in your life and my dad's life and our extended family, and I want to know more about that, because again, it doesn't just shape her, it shapes me, and it's going to shape my children, the way that I
Yes.
raise my children. So it's important to keep these stories alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not just immigrants have this kind of story. Like, I think it's across the board that as we're growing up, we don't think of what lives our parents had before we came along. Like you said, we're selfish kids. We're just figuring out our own
Yep.
lives. And so yeah, I think it's very common to just not even ask those questions about, well, tell me about when you were growing up, mom and dad. Um, and then I think parents sometimes don't think to share. As a parent, you're just so busy with the day to day that, you don't think to pass along those family stories sometimes. Now, you keep talking about your dad. Is he also an immigrant?
Yes, my dad also, he's a very similar story. Born and raised in Colombia, across the border in his early 20s. They're from the same city in Colombia, my parents, but they actually met when they were in New York City. They were, there's a big immigrant community in New York
Yeah.
City, a big Colombian immigrant community, and so they met I'm pretty sure that first year that they were in America, they met and started a family pretty quickly, got married and had kids, and the rest is history.
Wow, cool. And then as you were growing up, did you find yourself having to be an interpreter for your parents in school situations and things like that?
Oh yeah, I'm still an interpreter to this day. Especially for my mother. I think language often comes just more natural to some people, and so my dad, I feel like, got it really quickly and easily, and he never had to suffer through a really thick accent, so he
Hmm.
made it pretty easily. My mother, on the other hand, it just didn't come to her as easily, the language, and so she still has a thick accent. She still struggles to understand if people are
Yeah.
speaking too quickly, and sometimes people don't understand her. And so I'm often still, if I'm with her, like she had a surgery like 6 months ago, and I was like, I gotta be there. I gotta be
Yeah,
there with you, because I feel like there's gonna be a lot that's lost in translation, things
sure.
like that. And I remember something that I included in the book was when something about Melanie knowing the day and the month and the year that her parents were born, and that's just like not a normal thing for young children to know. And that was true for me, because I did help with filling out paperwork, and if we were being enrolled in school, I was the one that was helping translate, and at the doctor's office, like I was the one speaking for
Hmm.
myself rather than the parent speaking for the child. And it was just easier that way. My mom can certainly fend for herself. She's had a job ever since she lived in America,
Yeah.
but it was just easier for me to jump in and translate or whatever. So it's definitely something that I don't regret, that I don't think is sad because it does help you become a good communicator and become a
Hmm.
child who's not afraid to talk to adults.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a good thing. But I do think it's something that's unique. Like I've always known what year my parents were born and my
Hmm.
address, random things like that.
Yeah. And now, do you have siblings?
Yes, I'm the youngest of three. So my parents
Okay.
had, just like me, my parents had a boy and then two girls, and we're all 2 years apart, just like my kids. So I'm just following along in their footsteps.
So that's interesting too, because often I think the oldest in any family tends to take on a certain level of responsibility, but you were the
Yeah.
youngest and still found yourself in that role of translating and filling out paperwork and things like that.
Yeah, I think so. Our oldest sibling is a boy, and he was always very shy. So I think my sister and I kind of share. I would say we shared that responsibility. We're both more dominant people, and
Yeah.
we mind speaking up, and But my brother was always kind of more shy and kind of happy to be in the background,
Yeah.
and my sister and I were always happy to step forward. So we definitely. I wouldn't say it was all me, but so it was good to have an older sister too.
Yes. Yeah. Let's see. Now, have you ever been to Colombia?
So I have as a baby.
Okay.
I did go as a baby, and I am actually a citizen of Colombia because when I was born, I think I was a couple months old. My mom took me to Colombia, and you can become a citizen.
Okay.
I have a Colombian passport, except the picture is of a newborn baby. But ever since then, no, I haven't been. I remember growing up, my parents would go every other year. They would take turns going because it was so expensive. And we wanted to go, but they would always tell us it wasn't safe. And I believe them.
Mhm.
It wasn't safe,
Yeah.
especially for people like me and my siblings who we can speak Spanish fluently, but if we go to Colombia, they can tell that we're American by the way that we
Mhm.
speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And so they just never felt that it was safe for us to, even though we look very Colombian, if we opened our mouth to speak, they might know we're American and maybe it just wouldn't be a safe situation. Never take us as children, and then as an adult, I don't know. My life has just taken off. I don't even understand how I would ever find the time to do that right now. I thought about going when I first started working on the book, but I just didn't feel comfortable going with my newborn baby, and it
Sure.
was COVID, and I was like, well, what if I get
Yeah.
stuck in Colombia and I can't get back into the country
Right.
because I got COVID or something?
Yeah.
So here we are. It's 2025. I would love to go one day when my kids are much older, but we'll see. I don't know. I would love it's on my bucket list.
Yeah. So, did you have to do a lot of research then to accurately portray what it's like in Colombia, even though you've got all this family from there?
Yeah. Yes, I did. I did a lot of research, but mostly talking to my mom. When
Hmm.
I first started working on this book, my mom lives in Maryland, and so she came and stayed with me for a whole month. And we had breakfast together every morning at my table, and we would just talk for hours. We would just talk. She would just tell me stories. I would interview her. It was like I was a journalist, and I would
Yeah.
say, okay, tell me like pause this story, tell me this story again, or whatever. So she told me a lot, and then thankfully we also have Google Maps.
Yeah.
So I actually found her childhood home on Google Maps.
Oh.
It's different. It looks different now, but she was able to tell me this is what it looked like before. Now it's
Uh-huh.
this thing, but it used to have this black railing and it used to have this little backyard of concrete and we had
Hmm.
chickens back there. So that was pretty fun where like I could pull it up and she could show me like, let's go down the street on Google Maps and show me what the street looks like. So a little bit of everything. I talked to some of my other family members, but mostly just interviewing my mom and looking on Google Maps and doing a little bit of research about what landmarks are nearby. Originally I thought I can't write a book that takes place in Colombia without going there. And then I learned that a lot of historical fiction writers do that. So I was like, okay, I'm in the clear.
Right. Yeah, for sure, because we haven't figured out how to time travel
Yes.
yet.
Yeah.
Although we did have Gabriel Meyer was one of our, I don't know if you've read her Timeless series, and it's a time travel thing. So, If we believe her stories, then maybe there is a way to time travel. But yeah, so far I haven't figured that out.
Me
So
neither.
your grandmother Alba, did she actually have a little market right there in her house that people came in and purchased things and
Yep. Yep, all of that was true. She had like a window where you could walk up to the window. It was just like a window on a sidewalk.
like a drive-through almost?
Yep, like a drive-through, and she really did sew clothes, and she sold that clothes, and she taught women in the community how to sew. Like she would have like little classes in her home. So she was definitely an entrepreneurial woman,
Yeah.
earning income for herself. So in that day and age, was it's pretty cool to know about her.
Yeah, that is really cool. So sometimes there's a piece of the author within the story, and this obviously has a lot of pieces of your family, but would you say that there's a piece of you that is in Melanie? How are you guys the same?
Yeah, for sure. I so right after college, I did move to Miami, and I was working in journalism, but I was working in broadcast journalism. And so there's a lot of Melanie. There's a lot of me in Melanie. Um, that desire to be noticed and to be really good at what you do and to be successful. Like I felt that drive. And I think I may or may not have kind of shared more about this in the book, but that desire really comes from growing up in a poor family, growing up in a family that struggled, that didn't have very much. And in a sense, you almost have this guilt of like, it is now my responsibility to make them proud, and not just make them proud, but to potentially provide financially one day, because there is like my parents didn't have any extra money to save for college. They
Hmm.
didn't have any extra money for many years. Now they do a little bit to save for retirement, and so I they never expressed that or put that burden on me as a child, but I always felt like my parents have nothing. They came from nothing. They have nothing. They haven't been able to build much for much of my life. They worked really hard to do little things like help us buy cars and help us like move to college. When I was in college, my dad would help me pay for groceries, but I had a job and I was paying my own rent and I had a student accommodation. And so anyway, I always had this drive of like, I have to work really hard and I have to be really good at this so that I can be successful, so that I can have a career that pays, and so that I might one day have to support these people, or,
Hmm.
even to this day, my parents send money back to Colombia. That's another thing that a lot of immigrants experience. It's like you're constantly living in the past almost. You're still sending money back to people. And sometimes
Yes.
it's not even family. My mom sends money back to friends.
Hmm.
And so so I did feel that way. And I wanted to kind of put that drive in Melanie of like, it's not just because you want to have a lot of money or have a fancy name or title or anything like that. It's really this desire to make your family proud, because they did make a lot of sacrifices. I can imagine ever leaving this country and living somewhere completely foreign
Yeah.
by myself and raising children. Like that's a
Hmm.
huge sacrifice that I don't know, it would take the Lord audibly speaking to me for me to do that. It just sounds scary and hard. And my parents did that. And they did that because they wanted their future generations to have a better life and better opportunities that they didn't have. So I did feel that. And I do feel like I kind of injected that into Melanie of like this desire to like I can't just be like the average worker. Like I have to be really good. I have to climb the ladder. I have to make a lot of money. I have to be successful. And so but it also takes maturity, right? Like she's really young in the book. She's in her early 20s. But
Yeah.
that was my experience in my early 20s in
Yeah.
my working in TV. So that and again, like the difficulty with the family relationships was very similar to what I experienced. But yeah, just more of those sentiments of being that second generation and trying to make a future for the next couple of generations
Hmm.
is how I connect
Well,
with.
as I reflect on that, I think some of that is maybe a learned work ethic because although from an American perspective, you would look at your parents as having nothing, to them as they were hard workers and they compared to what they came from in Colombia, they have that drive to be successful because they're providing for people back there, and it's just you're doing the same thing as them, but just to a different level. You know, you're just
Mhm.
making better with what you've been given, which is exactly what they did.
So
And
true. And that's so true. And that's definitely one of the greatest blessings of my life is having watched them work as a young person and seeing them never complain about it. I mean,
yeah.
my parents didn't have one job each until I was in middle school, maybe. Before that, they always had multiple jobs.
Hmm.
And sometimes we were joining them. I don't remember if I put this in the book. I don't think I did. I wrote about it recently on Substack where when I remember being a child in New York City and we would eat our dinner as a family and then we would all get on the train and we would go to a bank in Manhattan and my parents cleaned that bank and we were there with them because they both had to go. So the three of us were there with them and we would help them and but I remember those things fondly. I don't remember it as like, oh, poor me or poor my parents. You know,
Hmm.
they were just always working. And I remember being in school and my dad saying certain things to me like, don't complain, just get it done, just do it, you
Yeah.
know? And I remember those things like as when I was working on my first book, thinking like, okay, I have one child. So what? Like move, like don't pity yourself, like just keep going, just get it
Get it
done, you know? And
done.
so I do I do really, really, really appreciate having grown up with that kind of work ethic as an example. And sometimes I think about how to um, pass that on to my own children because our
Hmm.
life is different. You know, we're
Yeah.
not working three jobs and going to a bank at night together
Yeah.
and things like that. And so I do think it is an incredible blessing to grow up that way and to see that. And sometimes I'm like, oh man, how do I instill that in my children when our life is so different?
Yes, yeah. So in the book, it was commented on how immigrants come to our country and they basically come to become servants and do all kind of the lowly jobs that nobody else wants. You know, like you mentioned, cleaning the bank. What kind of jobs did your parents have as immigrants?
Yeah. So I remember at one point my dad, he had all kinds of jobs. I remember him driving limos in New York. I remember him installing office equipment, like cabinets and stuff. Like he was in some kind of team doing that. Let's see, both of my parents did catering job on the weekends. So they would like put on black and white like
Hmm.
attire and they would just go to random parties in the city and they were catered like servers and things like that. I remember them having like magazine jobs. Oh, it was a newspaper job where they would like deliver like the New York Times on Sundays
Hmm.
and sometimes on Saturdays they would put the magazines in like the grocery stores. Like they had that
Yeah.
job. No idea how they got any of those jobs, but they had all kinds of jobs. My mom at one point, and this was in the book, she worked like as a seamstress in some like tiny little factory that was definitely
Mm.
abusing immigrants. What else? That's all I can think of in New York City. The bank job, did all kinds of odd jobs. And then my mom, whenever we moved from New York to Maryland, I think I was about 9 years old or 10 years old. From that point on until to this day, my mom has worked in daycare. So she is a teacher with like 2 and 3 year olds, and it's like
Uh-huh.
best job in the world for her. She absolutely loves children. And then my dad got a career with FedEx, and so he's been with FedEx ever since
Okay.
as a contractor. And so they've definitely made a wonderful life for themselves. When I look back and I think, wow, I remember what my life was like in New York. And eventually,
Sure.
when I was a senior in high school, they bought their first house, and it was a cute
Wow.
little row home.
Hmm.
So they were officially homeowners. They had helped all three of us buy a car, which was incredible. And no, we didn't have college funds, but they helped us however they could, whether that was
Yeah.
helping us with the groceries or gas money. And so to think about where we came from and to
Hmm.
the life that they built here in such a short period of time, and to think about my life here now as an author, and it's pretty incredible to watch them build this life that I now benefit from greatly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to switch gears for a minute. I'm going to ask a question of everybody to think about because as Americans, we really are all immigrants. Some of it is just back a little further. And
Mhm.
so I'm wondering for all of us, are there ways that you honor your heritage that you came from? Um, I'll give you an example. In my family, we have a Swedish background, and so every Christmas we make Swedish kringle, which is actually a recipe that came from my Norwegian great grandmother. So I'm kind of honoring both my Norwegian great grandmother and my Swedish great grandmother in honoring that heritage for them. But are there ways that you, Joanna, honor that Columbian heritage and kind of pass that on to your children?
Yes, yes, for sure. So this is kind of both inspiring me and making me sad because when my first child was born, I was committed to speaking to him in Spanish 100% of the time.
Hmm.
And I did really, really well until he was about 2.5. So he's 4 now. And so I was just a couple days ago looking back at really old videos of him, and he was speaking to me in Spanish, and it was so
Oh,
beautiful. But when I was when my second child was born, and she was about 1, I was just tired, and he was getting a lot older, and I was having to explain and teach things that I couldn't comfortably say it in Spanish. I can speak Spanish fluently, but it's not my first language. I would say English is definitely my first language.
right.
It's the language I'm most comfortable in. I can say anything and everything in English, right? But there's a lot of vocabulary in English and Spanish that I don't have. And so I slowly like started kind of getting lazy with it and not doing it anymore. And now at this point where my daughter's 2.5, my son is 4, my other daughter is almost 6 months old, I don't speak any Spanish to them, which makes me so sad because it was the only way that I was going to hold up. My husband doesn't speak Spanish, so I'm really the
Yeah.
only who could, bring this into our family. And so anyway,
Hmm.
you're inspiring me to kind of maybe get back to that a little bit, at least even little ways like reading books or things like that. But that was the main way that we did that. I've tried to make them foods like whenever my mom visits, we make arepas, and my kids actually do like them, so I'm grateful for that. But yeah, just Colombian food definitely, and a little bit of music thrown in there too.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And that was another thing I really enjoyed in the book was there were so many authentic foods and I read it on Kindle, which I really appreciate because then I could just highlight it and figure out, get the definition to pop right up like what is this food that she's talking
Love it.
about? So how about the rest of you? Does anybody else have a way that you honor your heritage in your family, or have you passed it down to kids or grandkids?
I use recipes that were in our family and my husband's family, but not necessarily anything from my heritage, just the things that we used to have growing up.
Well, I think that's great too. You know, it might not, it doesn't have to go back 3, 4, 5 generations, but just that you're honoring and remembering your parents. Like my mom made this for me, and yeah, I have plenty of recipes that I make that because my mom made them for me, and my kids know that.
And I have too many backgrounds between German and Swedish and Norwegian, and my husband's Czechoslovakian and German, and it kind of all blends together because none of them, they were all born in the United States. So
Yeah.
it's a little further back.
Right, yeah, and we start losing that. The further we get away from the immigrant, we start losing a little bit of that heritage. So, true. Anybody else?
Yeah, um, we eat a lot of foods that my mother and grandmother would prepare, and the method that they would use in the the pots and stuff they would use too, I now have. Um,
Oh, fun.
so that's kind of fun. They were British cooks.
Ah,
My great grandmother came from just 21 miles north of London, and So she taught my grandmother and then my mother and me. Um, so that's kind of fun to, have the custard pudding
Uh-huh.
that you can't buy it in the store. You got to make it.
Yeah.
Um, then we've done a good deal of traveling for genealogy and visiting the places where they walked.
Oh,
And
neat.
that is so wonderful. And I know the village 21 miles north of London, and it is so beautiful here. Why did they ever leave? But then in learning about it, they had tenements that were as bad as London, and I understood. Um, my great grandfather, when he came to Chicago, worked in the brewery. Well, that was a big industry in the town of Ware.
Mm-hmm.
That or making bricks. So he was a maltster. Um, then we visited in Northern Ireland, and I met the man who's my great great grandfather's grandson.
Oh,
And he was born in 1900, and
neat.
we actually were directed around by him as to where the farm was that 16 kids were born, and then they
Wow.
went throughout the world. Mine came to Pennsylvania. So, uh, just seeing where they've been and understanding why they came, why
Mm-hmm.
they moved. Um, that's important to me.
Yeah.
Uh, I know of that family of 16. Another one came to the Toronto area, and the story that Willie told us, that guy born in 1900, said, yeah, that we had a big party, and then the next day they were gone.
Huh.
And we were able to connect both Maggie and Willie to each other. They didn't know if they were still alive or whatever. They were in their 90s at that point. And that was neat.
That's really cool. So I hear a lot of food. I think food brings families together, and food is a good
Cultural,
way.
it's common, and I don't, maybe our bodies are just made to like that stuff,
Yeah.
you
I
know?
think there's some truth to that, that our ethnicity um, has just our biology of that has certain flavor tendencies that we prefer.
Mhm.
Um, I know it's very common in Scandinavia to like almond flavoring, and we're crazy about that in my family. Love the almond flavoring.
Yeah. And the Brits are noted for their bland food, and that's what I like.
Perfect.
So I remember when we were in Sweden that I had to go to a bookstore and get a book that had a fairy tale rhyme in it that my grandmother used to say. And it didn't sound exactly like I remembered it, but I still have the book.
Love
That's
that.
cool. Um, so does anybody else have anything they wanted to share, or does anybody have questions for Johanna that I haven't brought up, but you've been dying to ask? Elda.
I'm curious, how much of the journey, crossing, how much of that was true? Because it sounded so easy, and I know that it's not that easy. I mean, I just finished the book, I think it's called Solito, about this 9-year-old from El Salvador that crossed over, and that was a memoir. That was a true, and I'm like, yeah, and I read the book American Dirt, and about a Mexican, that was a novel, but she did a bunch of research. Those were like horrendous. And when I read this, it was like one person, so I was wondering how much of that was true, or how much of it, and how you felt about how the response has been about that, the
Yeah.
crossover.
Well, surprisingly, I don't know. I think all of it is true. All of it. It was easy for her. And I don't know if it was just because this was, let's see, what year was that? She was born, I don't know. I think it's in the book, maybe it's in the 80s. But it was easy. I had those same questions. I was like, what do you mean you just, there was a hole in the fence and you just went through it and you just crossed through this little puddle? Like it wasn't even like like an actual river. She was like, that's how it was. I just got on his back, like a piggyback ride. And his ankles were there. It was ankle deep for him, but barely, and we just crossed over and that was it. And then we started running. Um, so yeah, I know it sounds crazy that it was that easy, but I think, I don't know when Solito was written. I haven't read that one. I did read American Dirt. And they did come from, I guess, from different places because she crossed through Mexico. And I know in American Dirt, they go through they eventually get to Mexico. I don't know. I don't remember. But anyway, I had those same reservations. I was like, are you sure this is true? She only had to really, tell lies to get from Colombia to Mexico. Like that part was hard. Like she had to pay all these people and make up all these stories. But from then on, I mean, the story about the guy that took her around Mexico and like showed her around, that was true. And I was like, are you crazy, Mom? You let some strange taxi driver take you on a date in Mexico? What? You had dinner with him and you were going to let him take you to the airport the next day or wherever the train? She's like, yeah, I just didn't care. Like she was like, I felt so, what's the right word? She was just like, I just didn't care if anything happened to me because that's how depressed I was. I was just like, whatever happens, happens. And so, and the story about where the next, I think it was that same night when that guy dropped her off and the older gentleman in the hotel lobby was like, you're not getting in that car again tomorrow. I'm taking you. That was true too. And to this day, she's like, that was the Lord protecting me. That was some angel. Should she have trusted another strange man in Mexico? Probably not. That's not what I would tell my daughter to do. But at the end of the day, he really did protect her and he did take her safely to her next destination. The train, getting to the border was true. All of that was true as far as her memory serves her. She doesn't have the best perfect memory, but she was very confident it was just this chain link fence and there was a little hole and we just crawled underneath it like a dog would escape a backyard. We just crawled underneath it and that was it. And then she got on a plane in Texas. So yeah, it's pretty wild, but that was all true.
Wow.
I wanted to thank you because your book touched me in a way that no other book has ever done. I actually cried a few times through it because I feel like I'm going to start crying now because I'm like, she's telling my story.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, this is me, except it's a little bit different. My mother came here. She came here legally from Honduras, but she ended up in North Dakota.
Wow.
And then she married my dad who adopted me. I don't know who my biological dad is. And she had told him, if you want to marry me, she showed him a picture. I have these two girls back in Honduras. I was 2 and my sister was 3. She's like, I'm a package deal. It's if you want to marry me, and he said, yes, let's go, So he sent her back to come and get us. Well, in North Dakota, everybody's blonde and blue-eyed. There was no diversity back in the 60s. That was in 1965. There was nobody else that spoke. My mom and dad communicated through a dictionary because he didn't speak Spanish and she didn't speak English. So that's how they communicated. So her whole life was trying to learn the American way. So I didn't learn Spanish. I know nothing about my heritage. When Deb asked that question, I know nothing. The food, the dance, the music, nothing. Because she was trying to learn. I know more about Johnny Cash and Charlie Pride. And that's what my dad listened to. And Lefse and Lutefisk. Because in North Dakota, that's what Scandinavians eat, right? So I know more about that. I know nothing about my heritage. And yet, the reason I cried was because I think it was chapter 25 at the very last page. Melanie was talking to her grandmother, to Alba, and Alba was saying something about you're so focused on how hard your life is, something like that. You don't realize how hard your mother's life has been. And that really hit me because I did grow up thinking my mom still to this day has a thick, thick accent. She's always spoken English because she had to learn. She was in North Dakota. There was no community for her to, out in the farm. She was out in, um, she learned how to drive. She had to learn how to do everything, right? Because she was in the middle of nowhere. And yet it never occurred to me all that she was doing and how what occurred to me when I was reading that, what occurred to me was like, I'm so different. Everybody's blonde and blue eyes. Everybody looks at me different. Everybody looks at me because my mom has this really thick accent. It was all this poor me, poor me, poor me, when I was growing up. Never even thought, what to ask her, what was your, she made sure that my sister and I had appreciation for what we had. Like we had clean water, we had food, the stuff that kids would take for granted. She would make sure that we didn't take it for granted because she grew up without all of that. But she never shared her story. Even though she came here legally, it was still very, very hard growing up in the middle of North Dakota where she had no support. And she did it because she wanted a better life. She had said to her dad, I want to go to California. And her dad said, oh, no, 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 you're not going there. I have a friend who lives on a farm. Him and his wife live on a farm in North Dakota. And she's like, where's that? And he's like, if you want to go, this is where you have to go. So she, she had that desire, that drive for a better life. And then as kids, I don't think my sister and I ever really, really understood all the sacrifices. And it was interesting when you said your grandma came to live with you. My grandma came to live with me, with our family when I was in middle school, I think. My sister and I couldn't communicate with her because we didn't speak Spanish and she didn't speak English. So my memories of my grandma is watching her watch the I Love Lucy show. And because it's the only show that she could really understand, because it's all, slapstick, it's all physical comedy. My grandma would be crying tears and because she's laughing. Other than that, we had no relationship because we couldn't communicate, because at that age we were old enough. I think it's better when you're younger. It's easier to learn it. But by that age, we never learned it. So anyway, reading your book touched me so, so deeply, more than any other book I've read on this type of topic, because I felt, even though I wasn't born here, I was born in Honduras. I always tell people, I'm an American. I'm an American. I'm always like, I'm an American citizen, because I know nothing about, I've never been back. I don't, my mom went back several times, but she told us, it's dangerous. There's a lot of, crime and cartels. So we never went back with her. She always went by herself to see her family. But yeah, I know nothing about. So when I'm, reading how you hadn't gone back to Columbia, I was like, oh, well, that's me. You not relating to your mom. I'm like, oh, that's me. Yeah, I just thank you because I've never read a book where I could like really, really relate to. And then the scene about your mom in the airport, I actually went like this when I was reading it because I'm like, oh my goodness, that's me. I went to Mexico. My sister married a Mexican and they lived in Mexico City for several years, like 6 or 8 years, because that's where his family was. They took turns. They lived in the U.S. for a while, then they moved to Mexico, then they moved to the U.S. Now, just last week, they moved back to Mexico to retire. But when my niece had her quinceanera, we went to, my son is the same age, so he was 15. We went to Mexico for the quinceanera, and in the airport, they pulled me aside. My son, he looks white, he got to go through. They pulled me to the separate room and they were interrogating me, and I don't speak Spanish. And I kept saying, I'm an American citizen. I'm an American citizen. And that was before we needed passports to go. Back then, all you needed was your citizen papers. So I had my naturalization papers. I'm like, I'm an American citizen. I'm like, what? I couldn't. And when I got out, I asked my sister, um, why did they stop me? Well, how come they didn't stop my son? What is it about me? And my sister said, she said, oh, it's because of your nose. She's like, because I'm Mayan Indian. She's like, it's because of your nose. I don't know if you can see it. She said, um, they noticed right away that you're not Mexican. She's like, your son looks American because, he's white, but you're not Mexican. And they think that you're an illegal immigrant from Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, and that's why they pulled you over. And
Yep.
so when I read that part in the book, I was like, oh, I'm so grateful that they didn't like look at the cravings, the body, I was like, they didn't do that to me. But it was still scary because I didn't speak the language. So I felt so vulnerable in that. But anyway, so I just want to say thank you because there was so much in the book that I'm like, oh my goodness, that's me. And so thank you because I've never read a book that really touched me that deeply.
I really wish I could reach out and give you a big hug. Thank you for sharing that with me. It just truly affirms that this was the book that the Lord wanted me to write. Like, because I've had other people tell me that too, of like, I've never read a book that helped me understand my feelings about being an immigrant or a second generation immigrant. And so it wasn't me. Like, I've often looked back at things that I've written and I'm like, I don't remember writing that book or I don't remember writing that page or that paragraph and I'm like, that was both postpartum exhaustion, but also, but also just, I think God just wanted me to write this story to hopefully encourage other people that it's not that crazy. We're not that weird. And He sees us, even when we feel very unseen and very much like we don't belong. He sees us and he loves us. And so anyway, that's how my mom felt about sharing her story too. She was really nervous in the beginning and not sure if she wanted to share all of these intimate details about her life. And she read it and she called me one day and said, wow, I mean, if this brings somebody hope, then yeah, we need to share this story. So thank you for sharing with that. Obviously, our mission was accomplished. God's mission was accomplished. That's an incredible story too. That wow, yeah.
Thank you for mentioning about the not belonging because that really resonated with me because my whole life I've always felt like I don't belong with all the blonde and blue-eyed. I always felt I was ostracized for that, growing up in North Dakota. And then when I moved to Minnesota, I'm like, I don't belong in the Latino community because I don't speak Spanish. So like if I go to a restaurant, even like Chipotle, they'll look at me and they're like, oh, so you're too good to speak to us in Spanish. And I'm like, they don't know my story.
Can be pretty exclusive too. The Latin community can be pretty exclusive too. Like,
yeah. So
we're
it's
not
like I didn't
really.
feel like I belonged anywhere. And I read that in your book and I was like, oh my goodness, somebody that understands me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are running out of time, but Joanna, I want to give you a chance to tell us what you're working on next. Is there another novel in the works? What's going on?
Yes, I'm so excited to share that. Yes, I am working on another book and I'm working with Waterbrook and Multnomah once again. I had such a great experience with them. I love writing Christian fiction. So my next book, my goal I think is always going to be sharing stories about families. I just love familiar stories. They're the kind of story that I gravitate to. It's why I love Isabella Allende books. They're always intergenerational stories, and you get to see a beautiful big family and how the relationships impact one another without even trying. And so, anyway, my next book, I'm working on it. I have to turn it in July, and I'm once again postpartum. My baby is 5.5 months old, and so I'm still trying to figure out how to get it done. But I'll share a little sneak peek. It is another family story. It is another Latina protagonist. Only this time, she is new to East Nashville, has just moved from New York City with her husband and her two small children. She's new to being a stay-at-home mom. She's had a career back in New York. She has just had a tragic loss. She has lost a child after birth. And so when they moved to East Nashville, she's really, really in a bad place, just grieving and not sure how she will ever overcome this immense grief. And she moves in next door to a beautiful, wonderful elderly gentleman who is a retired preacher. He's a widower, lives alone. And this is inspired by a personal experience that I had when I lived in East Nashville, which is a very urban part of town. My next door neighbor was an elderly retired Baptist preacher who was a widower. And I was a new stay-at-home mom. I lived there when my first child was born. And we were always the only ones home during the day. I was sitting on the porch with my baby, and he was sitting on the porch falling asleep. And so that was when I had this thought of like, well, wouldn't it be sweet to write a story about a young stay-at-home mom who becomes best friends with her elderly widowed retired Baptist preacher? That's a long title. And so they become really good friends and have a lot of wonderful experiences together. And he helps her in many ways to understand this tragic loss that she's experienced. And he's also experiencing something tragic as well. And she's going to help him in some ways. And they're going to be best friends and help each other overcome some really difficult life obstacles. It's going to be really sad. I have cried several times writing this book. I was working on it last year and then took a break when I had the baby. Literally just typing and I'm crying. It's a very emotional story, but it will be filled with hope and restoration in the end. So I'm so excited. It'll come out next fall, so fall of 2026. So I needed more time this time. I was like, I have too many kids.
Yes.
I can't do another book in a year. That was really fast. Took some life out of me. So this time I'm going to take my time and hopefully write another beautiful award-winning book. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So it's due to your editors in July, and then we'll see it a year from September.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I love what a beautiful life you're making for yourself and that you're making your family your priority, but you're still finding time to follow your passion and write these beautiful stories that are obviously blessing a lot of lives. So we appreciate your story. We appreciate you coming tonight. Before we go, where should we connect with you if people want to connect with you further and stay in touch?
Yeah. So I have a monthly kind of writer author newsletter that I send out every month. I just moved it to Substack. So it's on Substack. If you want to find me, Books and Other Things is my Substack. And then I'm a little bit on social media. To be honest, I don't really get on that often. I just truly just don't have an opportunity with my I'm a stay-at-home mom full time. So being with them all day long, I don't ever have a moment to scroll my phone. That's just not a thing that exists in my world right now. So I do have Instagram, I do have Facebook, but I'm really not active. I post every once in a while, but mostly I do enjoy Substack because it's a place for writers. So if you're interested in that, you can find me at Books and Other Things. And once a month, you'll get an email from me with just like what I'm reading and a little bit of an update on what I'm writing in terms of the manuscript that I'm working on. So you'll get some sneak peeks. But yeah, mainly Substack. So I hope I see you there.
All right. Well, I will put a link to that when I send out the replay to everybody so that hopefully we can get some more people following you over on Substack.
Thank you, Deb.
All right. Well, thank you once again, and we appreciate you and we love your story, Johanna.
Thank you. I appreciate you all being here tonight, and thank you for having me. I really had a great time.